The 11th century is the beginning of the golden age of medieval Christendom. The first half of it, though, is definitely still the age of lead. And one of the most distressing features of this is the estrangement between Byzantine and Latin Christendom. The death of Otto III led to the election of a cousin of his, Henry II, as Holy Roman Emperor, or at least initially King of Eastern Francia, and he then, after a number of years, came down to Italy to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. This coronation occurred on the 14th of February 1014 and would turn out to be a turning point in the history of relations between East and West. The reason for this is because of the Filioque. Now, Filioque is a term inserted into the Latin version of the Creed of Nicaea-Constantinople, the Creed of 381, in order to assert that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Filioque means and the Son. This isn't in the original text. It was added at a council in Toledo, a local council of the Spanish Church, at the end of the 6th century. The Visigoths were then ruling Spain, and the Visigoths were Arians, but the Spanish bishops had worked very hard and eventually managed to convert the Visigoths to Catholicism, to Nicene Christianity. At this point, there was no practice in the West of including the Creed in the Eucharistic liturgy. The Creed was very much something which belonged to the baptismal liturgy, and the Creed that would have been used in the baptismal liturgy would not be the Creed of Nicaea-Constantinople, but the Apostles' Creed, which is what the Apostles' Creed is. It's the baptismal creed of the Roman Church. However, parts of Spain were ruled still by the Byzantines from Constantinople because they'd been reconquered in the reign of Justinian. And so the Spanish were probably more aware than most Westerners of Byzantine liturgical practices. And so they may well have been aware of the fact that the Creed of Constantinople 381, the Nicene Creed as we often call it, because half of it is from the Council of Nicaea, this creed was sung during the Eucharist by the Byzantines. Anyway, they decided that using this creed at the Eucharist was a good idea to constantly remind the former Arian Visigoths of the Church's doctrine concerning the co-equality and co-eternity of the second divine person. So the council in Toledo decided to add the creed to the Eucharistic liturgy, and they also added the phrase Filioque and the Son to that text. The reason they did it is because the term proceed in Latin means something slightly different to what it means in Greek. Procedere refers to the coming forth of a divine person from another divine person in a generic sense, so it would apply to both the Father and the Son in Latin. And this is because in John's Gospel, chapter 8, our Lord says, I proceeded and came forth from God. And in John's Gospel, chapter 15, our Lord refers to the Spirit of truth who proceeds from the Father. In the Vulgate and in the older Latin version, the word proceed is the same Latin word in both of those verses. Whereas in the original Greek, they're two different Greek words. So it's exelphon in the earlier verse in John chapter 8, which refers to the Son, and it's ekporoetai in chapter 15, the later verse, which refers to the Spirit. And it's that same verb which is used, the second one, which is used in the Creed of Constantinople 381 to describe the Spirit's procession from the Father. So as a result, the term proceed in Greek is specific. It describes how the Spirit comes from the Father, whereas in Latin it's generic. It covers both the coming forth of the Spirit from the Father and the coming forth of the Son from the Father. Now, these are distinguished from each other because there is nothing in God, there is no distinctions in God other than the opposed relations of origin between the divine persons. And this is what distinguishes the divine persons from each other. So the procession of the Spirit is distinguished from the generation of the Son by the fact that the procession of the Spirit comes from the Father through the Son, whereas the procession in the Latin sense of the Son is just from the Father, not through another divine person. The Council of Florence would later define this doctrine using and building on a formula adopted by the Second Council of Lyon, which we'll get to when we get to the 12th century, to the 13th century. So there was great potential for confusion. This was the confusion which Photius exploited back in the 9th century. And fortunately, that was initially overcome. But the problem was the estrangement between the Latin West and the Greek East had become even greater. The linguistic ignorance that separated them was even more generalized by the time one reached the 11th century. So the addition of the term Filioque to the Latin creed in Spain, which had spread out to Francia, because the Franks also thought, well, this is a nice idea, having the creed at Mass, and so they just started adding it, and they naturally used the Filioque. They had no idea that the Creed of Constantinople didn't originally include the Filioque. In fact, there was an embarrassing incident during the reign of Charlemagne where some Frankish monks in Jerusalem accused the Byzantine monks there of having deleted the Filioque from the creed, not realizing that in fact it was an addition made in the West. But this didn't affect Rome initially, because Rome didn't adopt the practice of having the creed in the Eucharistic liturgy. And in fact, when Pope Leo III, the Pope who crowned Charlemagne, discovered that this was being done by the Franks, he was very alarmed, because coming from an earlier period when Rome had still been being ruled from Constantinople within just a few decades, Leo III was much more aware of the fact that this would cause great confusion and potential dispute with the Byzantines. So he even put up some silver plaques in St. Peter's Basilica with the creed in Latin and Greek, without the Filioque in it, saying, this is the creed, don't anybody mess with it. Not, of course, that Leo III disagreed with the doctrine of the Filioque, he just understood the linguistic problem that it entailed. In fact, at the very same time, at the Second Council of Nicaea, the Patriarch of Constantinople had used the expression in his own profession of faith that the Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son. So it's very clear that the same doctrine was held on both sides of the Adriatic, and because there was less linguistic estrangement, they realized at that period the problem that would be caused by the addition of the term Filioque to the creed. But this was completely forgotten about by the beginning of the 11th century. And so when the coronation of Henry II was being arranged, Saint Henry II, he's in fact the only Holy Roman Emperor to be venerated as a saint, the Franks were like, well, we need to have the creed sung here, and the people in Rome were like, well, we don't do that. And the Franks, well, you should. And the people in Rome were, well, but we don't have any music for it. And the Franks, well, we do. So they just adopted the Frankish way of singing the creed, which of course involved the Filioque, not realizing that this was going to cause a spiraling downhill of relations between East and West. The Byzantine Empire itself was entering into a period of decline from 1025 onwards. Basil II died then. As we mentioned last century, he didn't have any children. His nieces had not been allowed to marry. Zoe, when she returned from Italy, was not given a new fiancé, but stayed unmarried. And so there was a lot of chaos in the Byzantine Empire for the following 25 years, while various people married these elderly nieces of Basil II, and managed to dominate the state for that period, and then were either murdered or died or whatever. And so there was a general tailing off of the revival which had been occurring. The appalling period in the history of the popes was beginning to come to an end. The last of the truly terrible popes was a gentleman by the name of Benedict IX. He was actually pope on 3 different occasions. He was, again, very young when he was elected, like John XII before him. He, in fact, came from the same family. He lived an extremely immoral life, like John XII had, and eventually he decided that he would resign the papacy. He was deposed at one point, but he managed to get himself reinstalled with the help of his family's supporters. But at one point he decided he took a fancy to a young lady that he'd known earlier in life and thought he might like to marry her. And so he decided he would give up being the Pope and but he'd paid a lot of money in bribes in order to arrange his election as Pope, and he wanted to get that money back. So he told his godfather about this and asked his godfather, who was a pious priest, about the rights and wrongs of possibly giving up the papacy and whether he could receive financial compensation for the bribes that he'd spent on becoming Pope. And his godfather was desperate to get his godson out of the see of Peter because he knew what a scandalous and terrible man he was. So he promised to pay Benedict IX the compensation for the money that he'd spent on bribes, and he himself, the godfather, became Pope Gregory VI. Unfortunately, later on, when the German emperors and more zealous and pious members of the Roman Church were trying to reform the papacy, they decided that Gregory VI couldn't stay as Pope because he'd effectively paid to be the Pope, which is the sin of simony, although he was doing it for the very best reasons. And so he abdicated as Pope and went off to live as a monk and a pilgrim in Northern Europe. And he took one of his closest advisors, the Roman deacon Hildebrand, with him, who will return and play a very important role in the history of the papacy. When he heard that his godfather had abdicated, Benedict IX decided, well, in that case, I shall jolly well have the papacy back. So that's when he seized it again. And the emperor in Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry III, was not having any of this and came down with armies and successfully deposed Benedict IX once again. He then tried to go back to Germany, but the Pope that he'd installed, the German Pope that he'd installed, died. And so he had to nominate someone else. And this was the great turning point in the history of the papacy. In the year 1048, he nominated a German speaker from Alsace to be the new Pope, Leo IX. But on his way down to Italy, he bumped into Hildebrand, the deacon who had been accompanying Gregory VI in exile. Gregory VI, in the meantime, had died, and Hildebrand had joined the great Abbey of Cluny, the great reforming Abbey of Cluny, founded in 910 by William of Aquitaine, and he had drunk deep of its ideals of purity and observance and centralized authority in the church. And he became a very close advisor of Leo IX. And one of the first things he advised him to do was not to treat himself as Pope until he had reached Rome and had been properly elected by the Roman clergy and people. So Leo IX entered Rome very humbly and subjected himself to proper canonical election by the people and the clergy who duly elected him. And so he took office officially as Pope Leo IX in the year 1049. And he then began to implement the ideals of Cluny across the church in general, led by a very strong conception of papal authority. So he was trying to eliminate abuses such as simony, the selling of clerical office, absenteeism, the failure to be present in a diocese or some other church that one was supposed to be in charge of. Pluralism, that's the possession of more than one benefice at the same time, being bishop of two dioceses or abbot of two monasteries or something at the same time. Nepotism, that's giving office in the church to someone because they're your relative rather than because they have any ability or piety necessary to discharge the office. He began to enforce clerical celibacy, as we've seen in previous centuries. Clerical celibacy is a distinctive practice of the Latin Church, which reacted to the breakdown in clerical continence, that is, clerics not having relations with their wives once they've been ordained. That practice began to break down after the conversion of Constantine. The other churches, the other ritual churches, like the Byzantines, they reacted to that by no longer enforcing clerical continence except on days when the liturgy was being celebrated, which is also why the liturgy isn't always celebrated daily in the Byzantine Rite, whereas it is in the Roman Rite. The Roman authorities, the Latin authorities, particularly starting with Pope Siricius in the 4th century, they began to stop ordaining married men and only ordaining unmarried men. That's why clerical celibacy became the characteristic discipline of the Latin West. But that had all broken down in the chaos of the disaggregation of the Carolingian Empire, but now with this Gregorian reform movement, as it became known, the clerical celibacy was once more being enforced in the church. There was also concern that people addicted to unnatural vice, who engaged in sodomy, had infiltrated various parts of the church. St. Peter Damian, doctor of the church, a great abbot, who was also involved in this reform movement, was particularly concerned about this, the infiltration of the clergy by people with these proclivities, and he wrote a very famous work on the subject called the Book of Gomorrah. So all of these abuses were targeted by Leo IX and his supporters, and they pushed hard for the reform of the church and were assisted very much by the laity as well. There were groups of lay people dissatisfied with the corrupt clerics and prelates in their particular parts of the church, particularly in Italy, who were great supporters of this new movement and who would try and drive out corrupt clerics from their diocese. Another ideal which began to find realization in papal policy was the direction of military efforts by lay people from the spiritual power. So this was applied to the removal of usurping clerics, to people who'd been excommunicated for crimes by the Holy See, but also to the reconquest of Christian territories that had been conquered by Islam. Leo IX actually himself rode into battle, not as an abuse, but in order to spearhead the independence of the Holy See against the Normans. The Normans were a group of Vikings who had been involved in the siege of Paris back in the 9th century, and who were bought off by the French kings in exchange for their conversion to Christianity and taking over the territory at the mouth of the Loire River in order to keep out any other Vikings that might try and sail down it and attack Paris. And this region, as a result, became known as Normandy, the territory of the Northmen. And some adventurers from Normandy went down to southern Italy and began to drive out both the Muslims who'd managed to establish themselves in southern Italy and in Sicily, and also to drive out the remaining Byzantine territories in that area. Initially, the popes, Leo IX included, were not very happy about this. They thought that this meant that they were going to lose control of these territories and possibly end up as the puppets of these Normans. And so they tried to resist Norman dominance in this area and to establish an alliance with the emperor in Constantinople on this subject. Unfortunately, this proved rather difficult because of a dispute which had broken out between the popes and the then Patriarch of Constantinople, a man called Michael Cerularius. Michael Cerularius had previously been a layman who had an interest in acquiring the throne in Constantinople, but he's been unsuccessful in his political machinations, and he'd been forced to enter the clergy. It seems, though, that he'd not completely given up his hopes of becoming emperor, even though he'd become a cleric and eventually Patriarch of Constantinople. And he decided to try and weaponize the declining relations between the Latins and the Byzantines and the declining understanding between them in order to promote himself as a sort of populist leader to the people of Constantinople. So he started to denounce various Latin practices that were not followed in the East as abuses, particularly the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist, and to even imply that the Eucharist confected using unleavened bread is invalid. Followers of Cerularius attacked the Latin churches in Constantinople and broke open the tabernacles and trampled the Blessed Sacrament in order to show their contempt for these Latin practices. This began to escalate into a serious crisis, and Pope Leo IX decided to send legates to Constantinople, both to try and arrange a military alliance with the Emperor Constantine Monomachos, and in order to try and deal with the aberrant behaviour of the Patriarch Michael Cerularius. These legates were led by one of the great pillars of the Gregorian Reform movement, a cardinal called Humbert of Silva Candida. Humbert took with him a bull excommunicating the Patriarch of Constantinople, but which was not to be promulgated unless he refused to cooperate in the negotiations. So the negotiations with the emperor went very well because the emperor was keen to deal with the Normans, but the negotiations with Carolarius went absolutely nowhere, basically because Carolarius was deliberately fostering this dispute for his own internal political reasons and therefore had no interest in diffusing the situation. Eventually, Cardinal Humbert lost his patience, and in July of 1054, he entered the Hagia Sophia with the other two papal legates and placed the bull of excommunication on the high altar during the Divine Liturgy, walked out of the cathedral, shook the dust from the soles of his feet, and shouted out, "Let God see and judge." And this is the terrible moment of the Great Schism, which has scarred the Church for the following 1,000 years. In fact, ironically, by this point, Leo IX had died back in Italy, actually in captivity to the Normans, who he'd not successfully defeated in battle, and therefore the bull of excommunication was invalid because a bull signed by a pope who has now died, which is promulgated after his death, has no binding force. However, Carolarius reacted by excommunicating the entire Western Church. The invalid papal bull of excommunication was directed only at Carolarius, specifically not at the Byzantine Church in general or at the emperor. But Carolarius decided to escalate things and to excommunicate all Latin Christians and bully the Melkite patriarchs, the other Eastern patriarchs who followed the liturgy of Constantinople, into doing likewise, to the great annoyance of the Patriarch of Antioch, who didn't want to have anything to do with it. So this was the unfortunate and unnecessary moment at which the Great Schism began. After this, Byzantine fortunes began to deteriorate even more, particularly after a catastrophic defeat of the Emperor Romanus IV Diogenes at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. He was defeated by a local Turkish ruler. The Turks had begun, an Asiatic people who'd converted to Islam, they'd begun to migrate into Asia Minor and put pressure on the Byzantine Empire there. But the Byzantine Empire had managed to hold them back mostly up to that point. But after this defeat, particularly disastrous because instead of being killed or just defeated and escaping, the emperor was captured by the Turks, and they held him for a short period, just long enough for someone else to be acclaimed as emperor inside the Byzantine Empire, and then they released him in order deliberately to start a disastrous civil war. And in the course of this civil war, the Turks managed to conquer vastly more of Asia Minor, and this is the beginning of the process of Turkification of that region, which eventually leads to it becoming known as Turkey as it is today, whereas it previously had been a very ancient Greek-speaking region of the Mediterranean. The Gregorian reform movement progressed despite the death of Leo IX, and eventually, after a number of different popes who promoted its ideals, including notably Alexander II, who gave papal blessing to the Norman attempt to conquer England, which succeeded in 1066. This was because the Archbishop of Canterbury was holding another diocese in plurality and therefore was seen as an abusive figure by the Pope, and also because the then King of England, Harold II, he had sworn an oath on holy relics to support the Duke of Normandy's claim to the English throne, and then violated this oath by taking the throne himself. So for both of these reasons, Pope Alexander II decided to bless William of Normandy's attempts to conquer England, which eventually succeeded at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. He seems to have sent him, well, he did send him a banner, the banner of the Roman Church, it's called in the sources. We know what the banners that he sent to the Italian lay people in the northern Italian cities who were fighting against corrupt clerics there looked like, and it was a red horizontal cross on a white background. So it's possible that that was also what the banner looked like, which he sent to William of Normandy, and that may be why that ended up being the flag of England, the St. George's Cross, as it was later called. But this papal sponsorship of a military expedition, a very successful one, would provide a precedent for the Crusades at the end of the century. In the meantime, however, the deacon Hildebrand the great inspirer of this movement, had finally been elected Pope himself and took the name Gregory VII in honour of his unfortunate patron, Gregory VI. His election itself was quite spectacular. The people were calling for him by name in acclamation, one of the last papal elections by acclamation to be recorded in history. And the enemies of the reform movement were particularly worried because now the great ideological leader of that movement was the Pope. And increasingly it began to cause tension between the Pope, Gregory VII, and the son of the previous emperor, Henry III, who now was the king in Germany, Henry IV. Henry IV had been a minor for a long time, which had actually given a lot of room for manoeuvre to the Gregorian reform movement. It's called Gregorian after Gregory VII himself, because although he isn't the first pope to belong to it, he's the inspirer of it. The problem was, the reason why there was a kind of hardwired conflict between the papacy and the empire at this time is because the reason why the Frankish king in the eastern part of the former Frankish dominions, the German emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor and king in Germany, the reason why he was the most powerful of the successors of Charlemagne's empire is because the bishops in Germany ruled such large territories, and the emperor was able to appoint those bishops. And therefore, even though there were very powerful local rulers in Germany, the dukes of Saxony and Swabia and various other places, they were very powerful and could act quite independently of the king or king/emperor. Because vast amounts of territory was owned by the bishops and the bishops were appointed by the emperor, he retained enough power in Germany to be the genuine ruler of Germany, whereas the ruler of Western Francia, what we now call France, had become almost nominal. He was so weak compared to the aristocracy in that country. But that, of course, constituted a very serious abuse. The appointment of bishops by the emperor. And it wasn't just a tacit appointment. The emperor would actually attend the consecration of the bishop and place the ring on the finger of the bishop and hand him the crozier. The appointment was actually received sacramental expression and therefore was particularly offensive to the pioneers of the Gregorian reform movement, not least Gregory VII. As a consequence of this, Gregory VII gave the Emperor, Henry IV, notice that he must discontinue this practice immediately or face excommunication. But to discontinue the practice would be to vastly weaken the power of the crown in Germany, and therefore Henry IV was resistant to this. Consequently, in 1076, Gregory VII excommunicated and therefore deposed the Emperor Henry IV, a sensational event, finally applying in its negative sense the implications of the coronation of Charlemagne in 800. The initial effect of this was to destroy the loyalty of his subordinates in Germany. In fact, Gregory VII explicitly absolved the subordinate rulers of Germany from their obligation to obey Henry IV. In desperation to reverse this, Henry IV rushed down into Italy and tried to find the Pope, and eventually presented himself outside the castle of Canossa in northern Italy, where the Pope was staying as a penitent, kneeling in the snow for several days, begging for absolution. A sort of moment of supreme triumph for the papacy in the Middle Ages. He did finally receive this absolution. The problem was that the Pope could not rely on him to genuinely desist from his delinquent behaviour, but he couldn't, as a pastor of souls, refuse someone who purported to be repentant of the absolution he requested. And therefore, in the end, Gregory VII was driven out of Rome by a newly delinquent Henry IV and died in exile. Although he died in exile, Gregory VII was still a winner. His ideals were prevailing in the church, and the attempts of the emperors to elect anti-popes who would support the imperial view of how the church ought to be run were not successful. And even though many of the popes of the Gregorian Reform movement had to live for most of their pontificates in exile, wandering around Italy and France, trying to set the church in order, the loyalty of the rest of Christendom was to them and not to the anti-popes, and therefore progressively their ideals were gaining ground, and winning the argument in the church. One of the most dramatic of these figures was another monk of Cluny, Blessed Urban II. Blessed Urban II, who had actually been prior of Cluny, was holding a local synod in a town called Piacenza in northern Italy when he received ambassadors from the emperor in Constantinople, by this point Alexios I Komnenos. The situation for the Byzantines had deteriorated to the point where the Turks were basically within sight of Constantinople. Nicaea itself, where the First Ecumenical and the Seventh Ecumenical Council had been held, had fallen to them, and the prospect of Constantinople itself falling and the empire in the east finally coming to an end was a very real one. Alexios sent ambassadors to the Pope in order to ask him if somehow he could arrange for military assistance to be sent from the west. Alexios' suggestion was seized upon by Pope Urban II. He saw it as both the potential to organise the whole of Western Christendom underneath the papacy and a way of placing the Eastern Emperor in his debt, such as would create the good feeling necessary to end the Great Schism. So later in the year, Urban II returned to his abbey of Cluny in order to consecrate their new abbey building there, the third such abbey building. And in fact, as a sign of the resurgence of the West, this abbey building was actually larger than the church of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. For the first time in hundreds and hundreds of years, the Latin West had the largest church in Christendom. A month later, he moved on from Cluny to Clermont in the centre of France, and there he held a council at which he placed Alexios' appeal before the assembled bishops and noblemen and general lay people. He gave what must have been an incredibly stirring speech in which he described the difficult situation of the Eastern Christians living under Islamic domination in the East, and he asked them to assist, to volunteer, to fight, to liberate them, with the ultimate objective of liberating Jerusalem itself, which had been out of Christian hands since the 7th century. And he attached to this an indulgence. Indulgences were becoming much more prevalent in this period. This was a very special kind of indulgence. Normally, for an indulgence, one has to complete the penance which is prescribed for the sins one has confessed, and then for any remaining temporal punishment, the indulgence takes it away by diverting the acts of Christ and the saints, their merits, to remove the temporal punishment owing. But the crusading indulgence substituted for all penance, including any that one might confess. So if one took the cross, as they called it, and promised to either liberate Jerusalem or die in the attempt, then that promise would substitute for all penance, including any penance that might be prescribed in confession. This provided as it was called at the time, a new way of going to heaven, because it allowed for the aristocrats of Western Europe to get out of their sinful lifestyles by means of a penance which involved doing what they were good at, which was fighting. Whereas previously they tried to put off confession until just before death and then found as many monasteries as possible before they died, which is a rather dangerous way of conducting your quest for heavenly salvation. This transformed Western Europe. People were driven into ecstasies at the prospect of being able to do this. Very large armies assembled. There were a lot of disorders connected with those armies. Some of the more volunteer ones that weren't aristocrats but were just ordinary people behaved quite badly, particularly in regard to the Jewish communities in Western Europe. But this was very much against what the popes intended. And the bishops, particularly the Rhineland, tried their best to protect the Jewish populations there. The Crusaders eventually reached Constantinople and pledged themselves to the Emperor Alexios Komnenos and proceeded on to Jerusalem. They were extremely successful, probably because their arrival was just so unexpected to the quite fragmented Islamic powers of the region at the time. Unfortunately, during a difficult period at Antioch, prior to their final assault on Jerusalem, it looked as if they might be defeated and captured. And word of this was brought by a cowardly Latin who'd run away to the emperor, Alexios, who was on his way to assist them. And the cowardly Latin Stephen of Blois, persuaded Alexios to turn round and abandon the Crusaders, who Stephen told Alexios was probably already dead. The Crusaders, naturally, who did in fact prevail at Antioch, felt deeply betrayed by Alexios, and they continued on to Jerusalem, and on the 15th of July, 1099, they captured it by themselves without assistance from the Byzantine emperor. The reaction to this in the West was absolutely euphoric. The greatest event since the resurrection, people called it. They couldn't believe that they'd succeeded. It was a clear vindication by divine providence of the papal program of reform in the Western Church, and it assured the papal monarchy for another 2 centuries in Latin Christendom. But unfortunately, it confirmed the distrust between the Byzantines and the Latins and failed completely to reverse the Great Schism as Urban II had hoped it would. The Byzantines in southern Italy were reconciled a year earlier while the crusade was going on at the Synod of Bari, presided over, or at least assisted by the great doctor of the church, St. Anselm of Canterbury. But in the East itself, nothing was resolved, and in fact the Crusaders began to appoint Latin bishops to fill the sees of Eastern Christendom, whose territory they'd liberated from the Muslims, which would cause further difficulties down the road.